I didn't realize it was so hard to whistle high. Because you always sort of whistle wherever you are. So, before I begin today, I do want to just say thank you again to Margaret Downey. Many of you know her, many of you do not. Margaret, give a wave. She's the head founder, the moving force of the Free Thought Society. She has been working to try to give free thinkers, humanists, non-theists a voice in our culture and our politics, and has fought for separation of government and religion in this country for many, many years. So I thank her for that and for bringing the Tree of Knowledge to our lobby, which she's been doing since the Westchester County Municipal Government decided they wanted to exclude freethinkers from their holiday display. So you'll find out more about the Tree of Knowledge if it's your first visit right after our platform. So at noon, as soon as we're done, we're just going to gather in the foyer there for about 5-10 minutes. We'll explain, and then people will begin to decorate the tree. So I do, every year when I talk about the Tree of Knowledge or mention it, I try to bring up a new theme. And this year's theme was conscience. And there are many stories that try to talk about how we think deeply about certain issues and against all odds strive to try to live closer to our ideals and our values. And during the short time that I've had on this planet, some of these stories have been stories told by Felix Adler, who founded the ethical culture movement, Thomas Paine, Mahatma Gandhi, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Anne Frank, and many others. But today I'm going to start with a children's story of conscience, the story of Pinocchio. Pinocchio, as you know, is a wooden puppet made by the woodcarver Geppetto, who comes alive, complete with speech and movement and conscience. And then he falls into all sorts of trouble. His sister, Grisella, worried that she might also lose her moral compass, and so Jiminy Cricket reassures her and says to Grisella, "Don't worry, Grisella, just let your conscience be your guide." So I'm curious as to whether you listen to your conscience, whether your conscience is your guide. Let's do this. Raise your hand if at least most of the time you try to let your conscience be your guide. Let's raise your hand. No surprise. No surprise. Some people are saying, well, what's conscience? So I can't raise my hand. So I'm going to start by talking about some philosophical and religious explanations of what your conscience is. I'm then going to turn to some psychological modes of understanding it, including the rational and emotional and animal parts of our nature. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about what I think is the most important ally of conscience, and that is willpower. So that's where we're going to end up today. So to begin exploring the philosophical and religious context of what conscience is, I'm going to start with Mahatma Gandhi, who was one person who really got me thinking about this about 30 years ago. He was a man of discipline and principle who was guided by his conscience. In fact, a very famous phrase that you see on bumper stickers and t-shirts is, he said, "The only tyrant I accept in this world is the still, small voice within me." And I wonder how many of us think of our conscience that way, that still, small voice. It's not totally clear what Gandhi meant by that phrase, actually. He explained that it's not easy to define in 1933, though, when he was fasting to protect the lowest caste of Indian society. He described it in a very concrete manner. He said, "For me, the voice of God, of conscience, of truth, or the inner voice, or the still small voice mean one and the same thing. I saw no form. What I did hear was like a voice, as some human voice, afar yet not quite near. It was unmistakable as a human voice and definitely speaking to me and irresistible. I was not dreaming when I heard this passage." I'm not sure what to make of this passage, really. Because when I listen to my conscience, I don't actually hear a voice. I would worry about that. Maybe the synapses in my brain reawaken some words that were spoken to me by teachers or parents. That's possible. And maybe I hear the echoes of those voices. But I interpret that phrase in a more general sense, that it's a type of intuition. A type of intuition. The actress Ingmar Bergman actually describes it that way. She said, "Train your intuition. You must trust the small voice inside you to tell you exactly what to say, what to decide." One Huffington Post contributor, Anna Naylor, tried to suggest that we listen to this voice even if it wasn't literal. She suggests we actually find a quiet place to meditate, contemplate, look inward, try to find what this intuition is. And she said that if we did that, we might find what Gandhi sought, which was a moral truth about how we must act, a categorical imperative in a way. Gandhi called it truth force. The force of this insight, I think, is why Gandhi called it a tyrant, because it pushes us. It was the only tyrant we would obey. Now, for most of human history, religious believers thought that this voice was the voice of God, right? The Quran says that God teaches the conscience about right and wrong. Bishop Butler, a 16th century philosopher, said that conscience was the constitutional monarch of our mind. John Calvin said that God pushes us to do what's right. And Martin Luther King Jr. observed that there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him it is right. Now, since a lot of Western religion is based on a metaphysical dualism, a dualism that says there are two worlds, the world of heaven and of earth, and that the heaven was pristine and perfect, and the world of the earth was corrupted and soiled, we began to use the term conscience to actually indicate something that pushes against our drive for pleasure. I think a lot of times we use conscience, it's resisting bodily temptations. Don't have that extra dessert. Don't steal that bread. Don't covet your neighbor's house. People with a strong conscience and strong desires and poor self-control can suffer a very guilty conscience. They can feel depressed and frustrated and anxious due to this clash, because satisfying our desires is portrayed in a lot of Western religious thought as a deadly sin, proving that you are controlled by lust, greed, gluttony, sloth. Deep remorse can grow if you can't make a truce between your desires and your conscience. And this can promote many religious folks to feel very guilty. So they go to confession is one thing they do. Go into a small room, confess your sins. The priest offers you forgiveness for your transgressions, and these absolutions give you temporary relief from the guilt. But then the guilt comes back again. Now, Felix Adler, who founded Ethical Culture, said that a divided conscience is one of the great spiritual pains of life. He was particularly aware that our conscience was divided between public declarations and private practice. He knew that we could talk the talk pretty well, but we didn't always walk the walk. And he wasn't a religious man, but he wasn't above using guilt. He actually did use guilt to try to encourage personal and civic ethical growth. I don't subscribe to that method, but listen to how he phrases it. He says that his evolving life mission is to, quote, go out and help arouse the conscience of the wealthy, the advantaged, the educated classes to a sense of guilt in violating the human personality of the worker. Adler placed a heavy burden on those with means during the Victorian era and after for taking responsibility for those who are basically at the end of the road. Guilt, whether it's in a theistic or secular community, however, I think can be quite painful. I don't think it's necessarily productive. One graduate of the Ethical Culture School inherited Adler's approach, Robert Oppenheimer, paid a price because he did have a conscience that he developed in ethical culture. After he answered the call of duty in World War II and worked to produce the atomic bomb, he was racked with guilt. One of his classmates, Daisy Newman, described Robert as being torn in two directions, to serve his nation and to serve his conscience. And for Oppenheimer, it was a painful psychological and for him spiritual experience. For him, it was a spiritual experience in a secular way. Now, having grown up in a totally secular environment myself, I didn't experience the religious aspects quite so much, but I did find a lot of psychological torment around my conscience because I felt this internal battle between ethical rules and physical pleasure. Sigmund Freud had a profound impact on how the West viewed conscience. Many of you know his basic theory said that there were three parts of the soul. One was the id, that represented bodily desires, the superego representing internalized authority figures, and the ego, vainly trying to struggle to make a truce between the bodily desires and these internalized figures. And many of Freud's patients felt beat up by the battle between the superego and the id because their ego was strong enough to get involved but not strong enough to figure it out. So they went through therapy. Now, I think people therapy because they can't achieve this inner harmony. They want to feel whole, not torn in two directions. And those with an active conscience, acutely aware of right and wrong, can feel particularly uncomfortable. Psychologist Martha Stout, who wrote a lot about the divided conscience, appreciated how deeply patients craved a sense of psychological wholeness and peacefulness that she described as what we call a clear conscience. The minister Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who paid the highest price for his conscience because he left Germany, went to the United States and could have stayed there, but returned to Germany to try to save people who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and he lost his own life there because of his conscience. Because he described his conscience as something that called to him from, quote, a depth which lies beyond a man's own will and his own reason, and it makes it heard as the call of human existence to unity with itself. Again, outside a religious paradigm, I think we all crave this unity with ourself. That's why divided conscience is so difficult. Now, I was lucky enough to grow up in a fairly comfortable environment, but Freud's paradigm still worked with me. Whether it was stealing that cookie from the cookie jar before dinner or experimenting with erotic pleasures as an infant, there was impressed upon me this sense of guilt for these pleasures. The stern Calvinism that dominated New England filtered down even into my tolerant household. And so I suffered this divided conscience, particularly in my younger years. And while it differed in detail, I talked to a lot of friends and many of you, and you feel the similar thing, this struggle. Many people who are raised to have high moral standards can't live up to those standards, but they can't let them go. And this conflict, whether it's between the id and the superego or described some other way, is what makes up a guilty conscience, a weighty conscience. When it's made public, it creates shame. And shame is such a prevalent and destructive feeling. So these dynamics are all involved in my sense of what my conscience is. So when I began to study philosophy, I looked for ways to solve the problem. And I believed for a while that there was a particular moral sense within each of us that understood right and wrong. When I was a young kid, I might not have had the vocabulary to describe injustice, but when I saw it, I knew it. I think Dickens was right when he wrote in Great Expectations, "In the little world in which children have their existence, there is nothing so finely perceived and finely felt as injustice." You know, how many times when you're young, you know that something is wrong? Psychologist Carl Jung said, Deep down below the surface of the average conscience, a still small voice says to us, something is out of tune. And when we were young, we knew things were out of tune. Today, we kind of know things are out of tune. Some might describe this recognition of right and wrong as a particular type of ethical sense, and that's what a 20th century group of philosophers led by G.E. Moore and others called it. They were known as the intuitionists. They believed that morality was bound in a particular inner sense, that you intuit directly. But as I grew older and more certain of the world, probably more sanctimonious about my moral proclamations, I began to think that more and more my moral proclamations were grounded in knowledge about the world, not just an intuition. I condemned racial segregation, I praised women's liberation, I criticized the war in Vietnam, because I saw the world, I saw the facts before me. Knowledge and reason led me to my dictates of conscience. Reason didn't really replace that intuition, though. I want to be clear about that. It strengthened it. In fact, Gandhi said that intuition was the heart of reason. He wrote, "The inner voice does not suppress reason, but rather sanctifies reason." Tolstoy, too, saw reason as fundamental to conscience. In the Meditations, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote that conscience was the human capacity to live by rational principles that were congruent with the true, tranquil, harmonious nature of the mind, and thereby true to the universe. Spinoza urged us to use our reasoning abilities so we could elevate our emotions from the specific to the universal. He said this will allow us to have the perspective of eternity. This was very much the heart of Lawrence Kohlberg's work, if anybody knows his moral development work. Kohlberg believed that the moral law was something that you discovered through universalizing principles, similar to the way Kant used them. I'll try to avoid too many more philosophical name drops, little footnotes. But as a young child who might see right and wrong as punishment or reward, Kohlberg said, as you grow older, you then see right and wrong as agreeing to certain rules that you either violate or obey. But the mature ethical person, Kohlberg said, was one who saw rational principles that led to declarations like, stealing is wrong, as a rational principle. And early in my study of philosophy, I thought that that might be the answer to my battles of conscience. Growing up, I was relying on knowing what was justice for me, but as I grew older, I began to worry about justice for all. I began to care about the fact that not I was being violated, but anyone was being violated. So that universalization meant something. And here was the seed that I think grew into what I call my ethical culture faith, which is the faith that every person has inherent worth. That in a non-supernatural way, they have infinite worth. They cannot be replaced. Now, in trying to put together what this all meant to me, I think it's misguided and even dangerous to rely too much on reason and universalization for this, because some forms of reason can be used to justify horrible behavior. Especially when the goal is a higher cause, whether it's a secular higher cause, like extreme political causes, or a religious higher cause, like inviting the end times, for example. So reason isn't always the answer, and the works of philosophers Hannah Arendt and Philip Haley showed that. Arendt wrote about the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, who justified his horrible actions, rationalizing them away. He didn't see himself as a monster without conscience, but merely as a good soldier doing his job. In fact, when he escaped to Argentina, Eichmann reassured himself that his conscience spoke with a respectable voice. Similarly, Philip Haley wrote about Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, who went even further and praised the ability of his troops to remain cold and calculating, rational, and above the sympathy of the people who they were killing. He said in so many words that the glory of those supporting the Nazi regime was in their ability to kill millions of people while suffering no harm to their essence, to their soul, to their character, to their conscience. He spoke as if his conscience was clear. Haley concluded that Himmler displayed, quote, a commitment that overrides all sentimentality, which transforms cruelty and destruction into moral nobility. So I wonder how many others use reason and rationalization in ways that on the surface at least allows them to escape guilt, shame that plagues so many of us who are guilty of lesser sins. So I began to focus a little bit more on animal nature, psychology. And what seems clear to me, what's missing from any rational explanation of conscience, is compassion for others. It seems almost obvious, doesn't it, that conscience must include compassion for others? Martha Stout, a psychologist, defines conscience as an intervening sense of obligation based in our emotional attachments. But often those who justify their work with the Nazi regime seem devoid of emotion. One person who saw the horrors of the Nazi regime from the outside, Eleanor Roosevelt, displayed an acutely emotional awareness of conscience. Roosevelt knew well how politics and rationalizations can lead to some horrible results, but she didn't ignore the compassion in herself. Too often we tend to react with righteous indignation when we see injustice. That's easy. But she said, when will our consciences grow so tender that we will act to prevent human misery rather than avenge it? A tender conscience. That seems a lot harder to keep than a clean conscience. It seems a little easier to wash our hands. Just let things go. A tender conscience requires that we care about the people who are suffering in the world. Conscience may involve a rational principle and the acquisition of knowledge about the world, but any conscience worth having, seems to me, has to have in it a sense of empathy and even obligation to those who are in pain. This empathy can be a form of love. The Second Vatican Council described, deep within conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey, its voice ever calling to love. The Pali Scriptures says that the Buddha discusses conscience not as being just about a calm, well-directed mind, but also about a pure heart. So I think as a minimal requirement, compassion needs to be a part of conscience. It seems that that's our animal nature, too. It's odd that many philosophers, from Descartes to Kant, actually believe that animals have no inner consciousness, let alone compassion. But if we look at animals, we see signs of conscience, emotions like regret, or shame, or remorse. I think our best friend, the dog, is particularly transparent in showing his guilt when you come home and you find the fruitcake you were going to bring to the party tonight has been eaten. Animals display deep empathy for each other. If you look at our closest cousins, the chimpanzees, they identify with each other deeply, with tenderness and care, affection and love. They try to make up after disagreements. They try to heal family rifts. They even try to reassure people that the relationships are still there after the occasional misbehavior. Darwin himself believed that conscience was something that had an evolutionary root. Moral principles are probably not articulated in some animals due to cognitive limitations. I get that. But many seem to display the sympathy and empathy and even a rudimentary understanding of the norms of behavior that allow for cultures to move forward and for the gene pool to continue. For Darwin, conscience served an evolutionary purpose in reinforcing constructive, cooperative instincts. As I turn towards my conclusion about willpower, I think that's, for me, the biggest battle. I think I have a pretty attuned conscience. I think you do as well. But I think we fall short because we don't live up to it all the time. So how do we let our conscience be our guide? Not just in our thinking, but in our behavior. At its core, ethical culture is a commitment to live by our ideals. It's a commitment that admits that sometimes it's hard to do that. We fall short. It's a pragmatic commitment that maintains a skeptical eye and admits that we're limited, so we shouldn't be too certain, because the Nazis were awfully certain. Humanism, in general, tries to urge us to live more ethically by treating each other well and creating a better society. This is why ethical humanism, I think, is important to democracy. Conscience is important to this experiment. Our founders believed that. That's why they focused so much on inculcating virtue in the youth of America. They believed without that, democracy would fail. It's only a system. That's why ethical culture focused on education, and why Adler founded the Ethical Culture School. That's why we have our SEEK program upstairs. That's why we try to learn together here. The philosopher Ronald Dworkin wrote how our idealistic but pragmatic democracy requires freedom of conscience. And allowing individuals' conscience to flourish creates citizens who accept their duties and try to live up to them. Dworkin wrote, "Freedom of conscience presupposes a personal responsibility of reflection, and it loses much of its meaning when that responsibility is ignored. A good life need not be an especially reflective one. Most of the best lives are just lived rather than studied." Hugh? Sometimes I think I study a little too much. "But there are moments that cry out for self-assertion," Dworkin says, "when a passive bowing to fate or a mechanical decision out of deference or convenience is treachery because it forfeits dignity for ease. Can we convince ourselves not to sacrifice dignity for ease?" Dignity is at the heart of stories of conscience. This August, I was privileged to visit the home of Aunt Frank, where she hid from the Nazi brutality, and she was able to maintain her dignity in the face of a menacing, degrading fascism. She wrote of the importance of developing conscience. She wrote, "You try to improve yourself at the start of each new day. Of course, you achieve quite a lot in the course of time. Anyone can do this. It costs nothing, and certainly is very helpful. Whoever doesn't know it must learn and find by experience that a quiet conscience makes one strong." Robert Oppenheimer, as I mentioned earlier, who went to ethical culture schools, was committed to his conscience. He said he was surrounded by men and women who thought themselves as catalysts for a better world, and that he was, quote, "driven to do his duty, to have a life of moral striving." The fact that Oppenheimer involved himself in the construction of the most brutal weapon is not a sign that he didn't have his conscience. He wrestled long and hard about it, and any one of us, if we were during a world war, would have easily been sucked up into the military-industrial complex and been involved. The fact that he was racked with guilt afterwards and worked for peaceful use of atomic weapons is a sign that he, in fact, did have his conscience. So having a conscience does not mean your goal is always going to be right. But it's striving that makes conscience. We're all mortal and flawed. Conscience is necessary, but not sufficient to live an ethical life. So the important question I realized after I worked on this talk today was not, do you listen to your conscience? It's, does your conscience help you live a more ethical life? How we live is why we gather here. to try to encourage ourselves and each other, to live closer to whatever ethical ideals we feel in our heart and that we share as a community. We come here so we can grow as ethical people. We know we'll never be perfect, but we try to nurture our conscience. For those who suffer, whether they're refugees at our border, whether it's a son or a brother or a wife who's struggling from depression, that compassion at the core of conscience is what we must nurture. And it is the willpower to act, to live an ethical life that makes a conscience worth having. Thank you.